So welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing one great crisis, how the world economy fell apart and why the economists didn't have a clue. With James Galbraith of the University of Texas, I'm Richard Parker, Senior Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center for Press and Politics. The Great Recession was officially over in the middle of 2009, but U.S. unemployment has stubbornly remained above 9% ever since. Consumer confidence is at an all-time record low. European economies are wavering, and Asians' economies are nervous. And there's a recurrent talk, increasing in the past few weeks, of a double-dip recession ahead. Our speaker, James Galbraith, calls this one great crisis, examining how it came about and why economists did not understand what was at stake or warn us to modify our troubled economic structures in time to avoid the crisis itself. Most citizens are not experts in economic theory, yet the prevailing theories can have a profound impact on our individual well-being. Why didn't current theory predict the economic meltdown? How could the public, from investors to employees to retirees, have been better served? What theories can best lead us out now from this Great Recession? James Galbraith is the Lloyd Benson Chair in Government Business Relations and Professor of Government at the University of Texas, Austin. He directs the University of Texas Inequality Project, an informal research group based at the LBJ School. He is the author of 7 books, including most recently, The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market, and Why Liberals Should Too. Galbraith writes for Mother Jones and contributes to the American Prospect, The Nation, and the Texas Observer, where he has frequently written about the current economic crisis. This is the topic for our discussion tonight. Please welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Professor James Galbraith.
Thank you very much, Richard and Pat. It is a great personal pleasure to be back in Cambridge, where I speak, and I perhaps should hesitate to say this in church, but where I speak to you as the heaven-sent representative of Governor Perry. I realized that this must be so earlier this week when I was at my family place, my place in southern Vermont. And the governor was in Houston praying for rain, and God delivered, unfortunately to the wrong address. It is true that now and for many years I live in Texas, in Austin, but it's not as far away in some ways as you may think. Some years ago, Senator Kennedy came to town for a political event, and I went over to say hello, and of course he recognized me and looked at me in some surprise and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Senator, what you have to realize is that Austin is just a warm suburb of Cambridge." It is finally a particular pleasure to be back in this church, where I attended Sunday school in the days under Reverend Ralph Helverson, when that consisted largely of learning the art of anti-war protest. So it's not the first time that I've been here in this place to oppose the policies of a president of the Democratic Party. And before I go down that road, let me note that it's a perilous one. Time and history have a way of changing judgments, as I found over 25 years at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin, in close proximity to the family, veterans, and archives of that administration, time in history may likewise change the present verdict on President Obama, but having said that, one has to go with the evidence in hand. My claim tonight is that we are in a single integrated great crisis that goes back 30 years that we have failed to diagnose, in part because it is politically inconvenient to do so, and in part because academic economics created for us a fool's paradise within which, as a matter of principle, that which has happened could not happen. The president's fault lies in delegating economic policy to a team comprised of people complicit in this fiasco, either from the political and pecuniary or the intellectual point of view, and in some instances, both. The fool's paradise emerged in the post-Depression growth economics of the 1950s, a world of cheap resources, stable institutions, subdued banking, and within what was then called the free world, unchallenged American power, and also complete innocence of ecological constraints. In that world, getting the savings and investment rates right was apparently the major challenge. Everyone was honest, or they got caught, I suppose, if they weren't. Technology fell from the sky like a gentle rain and never did anyone any harm. Such a world never really existed, of course, and everyone knows it, but economics, for the most part, refuses to deal with the important problems. In the 1970s and 1980s, things got much worse. Economists abandoned the goal of high employment, of full employment, and retreated into a thicket of natural rates of unemployment, rational expectations, representative agent models, efficient markets reasoning, and dynamic stochastic general equilibrium systems, which no less than the present chair of the department, economics department at MIT, calls the current core of the discipline, while continuing largely to ignore resources, ecology, automation, conflict, financial instability, and fraud. If the phrases I mentioned a second ago don't mean anything to you, that's not accidental. The entire edifice has served to wall off modern economics from everything else, permitting clear lines to be drawn between people who matter and people who don't. Consensus among the insiders thus became the sovereign goal. Things are as they are because the economists say so. This consensus was never absolute, but the debate became a very narrow one, basically between two groups, a perpetual motion machine society headquartered in Chicago, and a flaws and frictions faction headquartered largely here in Cambridge, but with branches up and down the east and the west coasts. Professor Paul Krugman, whom I admire greatly, calls these the freshwater and the saltwater schools, which in his famous New York Times Magazine essay, How the Economists Got It So Wrong, he accuses of mistaking beauty for truth. Beauty, he says, is the idea that capitalism is a perfect or nearly perfect system, gussied up with impressive-looking equations. It's a curious notion of beauty. I've never heard the phrase gussied up applied to the Venus de Milo. But never mind that. The important point is that any economist who did not agree with one of these two very narrowly separated positions was consigned to the backwater, to a diaspora of liberal arts colleges, shoestring think tanks, and Class B state universities, where it was possible to lead a perfectly respectable and even pleasant existence, but where, for practical and effective purposes, you ceased to exist. Three groups in particular wandered in this wilderness for many years. They were followers of the Anglo-Irish Cambridge University economist Wynne Godley, who placed great formal emphasis on getting basic accounting relationships right so that one might understand, for example, that public deficits supply financial resources to the private sector, dollar for dollar, penny for penny. When the government spends more than it takes in as taxes, the private sector necessarily has more income than it pays in taxes. Not to mention the relationship between the trade deficit and the budget deficit. When we supply reserves, financial reserves to the world economy, we must necessarily import more than we export and run a corresponding deficit in the public accounts. The second group were the followers of an economist who spent most of his career at Washington University at St. Louis, Hyman Minsky, who stressed the inherent instability of financial markets, in particular that stability itself is a cause of instability, by the very simple mechanism that as time goes on, in good times, people become overconfident and start demanding higher returns and pushing the bounds of what is possible. And the third group I would call, with a certain amount of family pride, the Galbraithians, who stressed the importance of organizations, the great corporations and the institutions which in a well-run society balance their power, and who understood that it was a very bad idea to detach the chief executive from the firm by paying him according to stock market valuations, and who also understood that conventions and habits and the rule of law had to govern the conduct of organizations, or else they had the potential to collapse. Did the backwater economists, I coined that phrase, by the way, and claim trademark to it, understand what was coming down? I convened a group of them in June of 2008 and prepared a memorandum for the Obama campaign, which was dispatched on July 8th of that year. It reads in part, the most important common ground was over the depth and severity of the ongoing financial crisis. Participants placed it out of the league of financial events since the early 1930s. One called it epochal and history-making. What distinguishes this crisis from the others is that it emerges from the United States, that is, from the center and not the periphery of the financial system. It reflects the collapse of a bubble in an economy driven by repetitive bubbles, and the bubble has been vectored into the financial structure in a uniquely complex and intractable way via securitization. This is a global crisis originating in the United States. The memo went on to predict a long slump through 2011 at least that would be met by inadequate stimulus packages, and to warn that quote, the political capital of the new presidency risks being exhausted quite quickly in a series of short-term stimulus efforts that will do little more than buoy the economy for a few months each. Since they will not lead to a revival of private credit, every one of those efforts will ultimately be seen as too little too late, and therefore as ending in failure. Although at the time I was in contact at least several times a week with the Obama campaign team, and this was in July, this was after Bear Stearns, but before Lehman Brothers and all the rest, the memorandum received no reply. The fact that the system in particular was riddled with fraud is something that the economics profession has found practically impossible to come to grips with, and that the political system has been at great pains to overlook or deny. The evidence has been presented, however, very clearly in excellent official reports, astonishingly good documents, the report of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the report of the Special Investigator General of the TARP program, the Congressional Oversight Panel, the Senate Investigations Subcommittee. The import of this is beginning to dawn on the world as the Federal Housing Finance Agency files its massive lawsuits, nearly $200 billion so far, and as certain top bankers engage top criminal attorneys. But it should not have taken so long. The fraud was there for everyone to see. It was in part a simple matter of language. This was an industry where the product was called by the people who produced it liar's loans. Ninja loans, loans for people with no income, no job, or assets. Neutron loans taken from the nuclear lexicon, loans that would explode, destroying the people but leaving the buildings intact. The residue of the securitization was called toxic waste. What does this tell you? Does it suggest, perhaps, that the people in the industry were aware that the work they were engaged in was not 100% honest? Would you eat in a restaurant where the waitstaff referred to the food as scum, sewage, and sludge? Pursuing this question of language, I think, we can help to understand what the system consisted of. Millions upon millions of documents were issued that were called mortgages. But they were not mortgages in any ordinary sense. They were not issued to people who were expected to pay them off. They were issued to people who were not expected to pay them off, who would have to refinance or who would default, and the lenders knew it. These were counterfeits. This was, in effect, a counterfeiting ring on a massive scale. The counterfeited documents had to be presented to an investing public. This is called laundering. It is what the credit agencies did when they took the mortgage-backed securities, which were junk and worse than junk, fraudulent to the core, and packaged them and labeled them as AAA. Right? Then the documents which had been counterfeited and laundered had to be fenced, is the term I think that purveyors of stolen merchandise use, to the wider world. That was the job of the commercial and the investment banks. That's what they did. And finally, there had to be a victim, a mark. One of the marks apparently was AIG, the insurance company which issued credit default swaps against these instruments, amazingly. But Michael Lewis, in his book, The Big Short, tells us who the other mark was. Who is buying this stuff, someone asked, and the answer came back, Dusseldorf. Dusseldorf. The stuff was being sold to the world, and in particular to the wealthy world, to Europe. And this is the cause of why I say it's one great crisis, because it's not just an American crisis, it's a global and especially a European crisis. Intimately linked. What happened? As the European investors and especially banks realized that their toxic American assets were going to cause them enormous losses, they looked for other assets to sell so that they could gain safety. And so they sold the weak sovereign credits. They sold Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain. Okay? Causing an integrated, inseparable, unified crunch on all of those countries, which they could not have prevented by any policy and cannot cure by any actions that they can take on their own. It is the old mountain climbing problem of 6 people on a rope. If one of them falls, the other 5 can hold him. If 2 of them fall, the other 4 maybe can hold them. If 3 fall, the other 3 haven't got a chance, and they either have to let them go, all go together, or cut the rope. And that is the situation facing Europe as we speak, as Italy is in that position of being the third man. Meanwhile, as Rome burned, congressional Neros fiddled away, abetted by the White House in a bipartisan concerto on an irrelevancy none of them understands, budget deficits and the national debt. A sound and light show of no intrinsic economic consequence, despite everything that is said about it, but great potential for harm. I could give you many reasons why the statement I just made is true, but I'll just say that it's obvious that the capital markets, that people with money on the line, agree with me. Even in the enormous fury, now practically forgotten, of 3 weeks ago over the debt ceiling and the potential default of the US government never before in history, and the downgrade of government debt by Standard & Poor's, what happened? People sold other assets to buy United States Treasury bonds because they were safe, and the yields on those bonds didn't rise, they fell. That tells you exactly what you need to know, and you can read it in the paper every single day. Yet the potential for harm is there, and it comes from another emerging consensus, partly amongst economists, and certainly between economists and politicians. While agreeing to disagree over whether another short-term program, another stimulus would be a good idea, the freshwater people say no, and the saltwater people say yes, this crowd comes into alignment about the long term, those threatening long-term deficits, which are actually nothing but unreliable projections on somebody's computer. Something must be done, they say. But what can you do today about the long term? You can only cut the programs that have been legislated for the long term. You can't cut the Pentagon budget 10 years from now. It's not appropriated until 9 years from now. So what can you cut? You can cut Medicaid. You can cut Medicare. You can cut Social Security. And a consensus begins to congeal around that program, the agreed-on trade-off if some pathetic new stimulus is proposed. What is the president offering tonight? I haven't seen the speech. I'm told unemployment insurance extensions, an extended payroll tax cut. These are good things. I'm not opposed to them. They're useful relief, but they will not create jobs. Unemployment insurance is a relief program. It's not a jobs program. An infrastructure bank would be valuable, but it's not a jobs program. And in return, I fear, we will be fed cuts in vital, effective, sustainable programs on which many Americans rely, and all of us hope to rely someday. Programs that actually do matter, that have made a great difference in our national life. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. People often ask me to offer a program as I wrap up a speech, and I can do so, focused on jobs and the foreclosure crisis, our need to rebuild the country, energy security, and climate change. But on this occasion, and in part under the strict time constraints of the Cambridge Forum, I will spare you. The most important battle coming up will be precisely to protect benefits under Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid from their historic enemies and from those who would trade them off to get through the next election. That's where we need to draw the line. And while you're fighting that fight, as I hope you will in the months ahead, because a great deal is at stake for this generation and the next one, do spare a thought to the administration that enacted two of those programs, Medicare and Medicaid. There are reasons, as I said at the beginning, why the verdict of history on presidents changes, sometimes for the worse and sometimes for the better. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of the world economic crisis and the failure of the economics profession to foresee it with political economist James Galbraith. Let me ask the first question. Do you foresee us entering a serious second recession in the coming 6 to 12 months?
We never escaped the first recession for any practical purpose. The Economist definition is a technical matter. What matters to working families is whether they have jobs, and when you have a 9% unemployment rate, you haven't gotten out of the first recession. Will the growth rate turn negative? Will there be a sharp fall? I'm skeptical for two reasons. Most of the things which are most volatile in the economy, housing, for example, is already so low that even if it dropped in half, it's not going to make a big difference. It's one thing to lose 1 million starts per year when you have 2 million to play with. When you have 400,000 or 500,000, I don't know what the present number is, and you lose another 200,000, it's a drop in the bucket. So I think it's a technical issue. It's a side question. What is clear, what should now be clear, is that we do not have in place the mechanics for the sustained and durable and sensible economic expansion that we need. We don't have the institutions. We don't have the financial institutions. We don't have the debt capacity in the private sector. Households are basically insolvent massively because of the falling value of their homes. They're still experiencing debt deflation. And this problem should have been addressed in January of 2009. It was not. The question is whether we can turn around, focus on it, and begin to deal with it in an effective way before it gets dealt with basically by people defaulting on their mortgages and walking out on their homes in even larger numbers than they are already doing. That's where we're going. That's where we're going, and that's a painful adjustment that takes a very, very long time.
You've spoken about the Obama administration's performance to date and also a bit about the speech he will give tonight. Say something about the Republicans' plans for the American economy.
Well, now that is a very difficult question. When you put the word Republican and plan into the same sentence, I have to say I draw a blank. I was pleased last night to learn that Governor Perry knows the phrase Ponzi scheme, which he applied to Social Security. I can tell you that it's one thing to know a phrase and another thing to know what it means. Social Security is not a Ponzi scheme. There are, one of the Republican candidates, I think one can really like and admire in many ways, John Huntsman. No, seriously, this is a fellow who came over to work for the president when he was asked, and by all accounts did a credible job as an ambassador in China. Wants to eliminate taxes, basically eliminate taxes on the wealthy altogether, capital gains, dividends, the works. I think we can say effectively that we've seen that experiment. It produced a great deal of very nice houses in Central Texas. But when you lower taxes on individuals who control companies, guess what they do? They take the corporate cash flow, which they were previously retaining and investing, and they start paying it to themselves as salary. This is what any economics would predict, and it's what, in fact, we've observed since the 1970s when we started down this path. When was the last time you saw a corporate skyscraper go up? They now build relatively inexpensive campus-type buildings. I'm not saying that's worse. I'm just saying they're not using the money that previously stayed in the organization, goes into personal palaces. So we become a country full of personal palaces. That's an economic plan. It's very good if your supporters happen to be people who can afford palaces. But it's not a plan that's terribly useful for anyone else.
Over the past 30 years, the direction of American income and wealth distribution has reversed course from the previous 30 years. Do you see this as a trend that will continue on into the future? Do you see reasons for believing that the trends of the last 30 years are weakening or shifting in another direction?
To the extent that the fortunes of the very wealthy depend upon inflation in capital asset values, in the stock market, real estate markets, we are seeing one of the colossal equalizations of all time, because those assets are have fallen very rapidly. Stock market has been held up by corporate buybacks as a major factor. But unfortunately, the great middle class had a lot less to lose. And it's much easier for them to go from modest comfort to a condition of great insecurity in a very short period of time. And that has happened. And that's where I would put the emphasis here. What we've seen is a world that we created over 70 years since Roosevelt, in which there was an American middle class that was based upon a job you could reasonably expect to hold, a house that you could reasonably expect to own eventually and to have some value in when you retired, and Social Security and Medicare that would provide a backstop on which a great many working Americans ultimately rely. These days, only the last two of those are left, and Medicaid, which plays an important role as well. That's what we have. That is not the substance of a middle class. It is barely enough to keep a lot of people from really dire poverty. And the idea that we should move down the road of further weakening those programs, of increasing the retirement age or on Social Security or the eligibility age on Medicare, cutting back on the access to Medicaid services, this is where I see the great disasters looming ahead.
You're listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of the world economic crisis and the failure of the economics profession to foresee it with political economist James Galbraith. Now let's take some questions from the audience. Please come forward and line up at the microphone, and please limit yourself to one well-phrased question so that as many people as possible may ask theirs. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Deborah Butler, and my question is, Thomas Geoghegan, an economist in Chicago, in his Harper's article in 2008, it was called Infinite Debt, How Unlimited Interest Rates Destroyed the American Economy. He's arguing that cheap credit, of course the uncapped interest rates, has caused a major loss in jobs in the United States. And he believes that by allowing states to use their usury caps, Massachusetts has an 18% usury cap on credit card interest rates, that would funnel money out of the financial institution industry into manufacturing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, I'm not
If
sure
you agree.
I quite grasp the thrust of the question. If you could just...
Well, he's tying an effort to cap interest rates to an eventual increase in manufacturing and therefore jobs in the United States.
2 points. I think we need to rebuild the financial system from the ground up. And that does involve making access to credit, once again, available on reasonable terms. The problem that we had there was massively victimization of our most vulnerable populations. And that problem has not been fixed. It's not been fixed from the standpoint of the debtors, and it has not been fixed from the standpoint of the institutions. People are still in place who were responsible for that. The accounts have not been corrected. People who committed crimes have not been punished. This is necessary if we are going to have a credible financial system going forward. We've been through this before. In the early 1980s, we had the savings and loan crisis. And in the cleanup following that crisis, there were a large number of white-collar criminal prosecutions. Over 1,000 insiders in that industry were indicted, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned in federal prisons for crimes committed in the defrauding of the savings and loan industry. We have not seen any comparable effort at this moment. And I have to say, one can see the benefits of having done that in my state, in Texas, because we were a center of that fraud. And Texas banking law was considerably stricter this time around than in California or Florida, and we don't have the same degree of predatory mortgage lending, the same degree of foreclosures, the same degree of housing crash. So regulation can work if it's enforced. Will this bring back manufacturing? I think there are things that we can manufacture in the United States. There are things that we do manufacture in the United States. There are things that cannot be manufactured effectively anywhere else. We can and should remain the center of high technology and advanced systems manufacturing. If we put our efforts and investment into that, we can do that. At the same time, we cannot stop the rest of the world from manufacturing what they want to manufacture. We cannot stop the Chinese from doing what they want to do, nor should we try. They are doing it for their own purposes, and the fact is those goods will be produced whether we like it or not. If we needed to replace let's say a Chinese supply went away, that kind of manufacturing can be built up quite quickly. So I don't see that really as the issue. Over the course of the past century, agriculture went from 40% down to 2% of employment. Manufacturing is going to fall no matter what. We need to think about useful jobs, important jobs that people can do that address the problems that we actually have now. We have a lot of problems with energy. We have a lot of environmental problems. We have a lot of rebuilding problems. We have a lot of care issues. We have a lot of educational questions. We have a lot of social questions that a great many people have appropriate skills and talents for. We need the institutions to put them to work.
I'd like to get back to something you've discussed a little bit already, which is the relationship between politics and the economy. Mm-hmm. And especially I'm referring to the recent discussions in Congress about the debt limit. which I think vividly demonstrated that the Congress, especially the entire national government, but especially the Congress, is totally dysfunctional. So now, I don't know whether you agree with that, but I suspect in part you do. How can we get out of the recession with a dysfunctional Congress and semi-dysfunctional president?
The first thing that needs to happen is that the president needs to use the powers that he actually has much more effectively than he has done. He could very well have put an end to the debt ceiling charade, to that whole circus, quite early on. And there were several powers that he, in fact, does have under current law, that he simply opted not to use. And my view is that he should have used them, that Lyndon Johnson would have used them, that Jack Kennedy would have used them, that you have to be prepared to fight back. I am not often in the position of stating a point of admiration for President George W. Bush, but one of President Bush's principles was you don't negotiate with yourself. He came down with the position he wanted, and if he had to give something to get it, he did it at the end of the process, not at the beginning. The fact that the president gave away so much of what would constitute an effective economic response in the debt ceiling debate, and ended up handcuffing his administration and future administrations, is, I think, a sign of where his values fundamentally are. He did it, I think, because he wanted to, and that is the problem. Sir.
Hi. I'd like to share with you a vision that I have, which is the physical economic principle, which will be realized by the economic principle of a physical economy proposed by Lyndon LaRouche, which is the North American Water and Power Alliance project to construct nuclear power plants and to have a massive water management system and transportation infrastructure program to employ the unemployed construction workers, the youth generation, which is being lost presently, and all of our intellectual capital here in the engineering and trade schools of Boston, Massachusetts, and the New England area generally. So I ask if you share in my vision to employ millions of people immediately by passing the Glass-Steagall reinstatement of Franklin Roosevelt's policy to end this hyperinflationary bailout, which is only worsening the transatlantic breakdown crisis.
Your question focuses specifically on Glass-Steagall, which was a very important law and a very valuable law, and a law whose principle was that banking institutions that take deposits and have deposit insurance should be very limited in what they can do with that money, because they're effectively playing with money that is not theirs. Investment banks, on the other hand, can speculate and should be allowed to go bankrupt. I think the principle is a good principle. I don't think you can implement that principle in the modern world. I think that the problems, when you have the current degree of integration between entities that are under U.S. jurisdiction and entities that are not, and the current degree of technological linkages, the problems go much deeper. My sense is that the financial system, effectively, as we have known it, is cooked. That it is not going to recover to resemble anything that we have seen in the last, let's say, 40 years. And so we need to rebuild new institutions that do what we want financial institutions to do, to provide the services that they need to provide, their utility-type services, deposit, check clearing, payment services, provide the credit services, support small businesses, provide credit to productive corporations, support nonprofits, to do whatever you want a financial system to do. And that we will need to rebuild those institutions, beginning by dismantling the power of the large banking institutions which have effectively come to dominate the banking structure. 5 or 6 banks with 50, 60% of the market is far too much. It's far too much from any economic standpoint. It's basically a question of political power and the aggrandizement of the executives. You need a big bank in order to justify a big salary. One way to get rid of that problem is to have a lot of small banks, and then they will pay themselves modest salaries and provide services to their communities, which is what bankers should be doing.
I do want to address one aspect to the financial crisis that you were going through, which is actually more causative than some of the processes that you put forward. And it was something that started a very long time ago, actually after Roosevelt's death, before the end of World War II. What happened was the institutions that were allowed to take over, because Roosevelt's mission was not seen to because he died. Their idea was that we could take the physical economy, which Roosevelt had built up, the actual manufacturing power, which we were going to offer to other nations across the planet, nations that were being freely freed from the British Empire, etc., India, some of the nations of Africa. We were going to offer that technology up so that nations across the planet could also be self-sufficient, as they had seen the United States of America, the young United States of America. As soon as Roosevelt died, that idea was attacked from within inside of his own government. And the process of asset stripping, taking down the physical economy, which is the actual basis for capital returns, physical capital returns, and other types of returns on the federal level, state, and municipal level, taking that down at basis is the actual reason why you would have to begin to speculate and cannibalize the financial aspect of the economy. That was a cause that began in the 50s, in the 60s. You saw how Jack Kennedy had attempted to deal with it somewhat successfully. I have a question. With the NASA program. And he did, I have a question. I'll get to it. And he dealt with it with the NASA program. What we're looking at today, and what Lyndon LaRouche did forecast way back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, is that you need a physical economic basis. You want to talk about job creation? You need a great project. The level of collapse, as you yourself said, in the manufacturing sector, in the engineering sector, can only be reorganized and focused through a project.
You need to ask the question. There are many people behind you.
I'm almost done.
Okay, then
I'm
ask
almost
the
done.
question. Question,
I'm almost
please.
done.
Question.
Through a project like NWAPA. The only way we can get that done is if we shut down the bailout section of the banking system.
Question. You need to ask a question.
Can you guys calm down? I have a question. I have a question.
Ask the question,
It's my question.
please.
We have to re-implement Glass-Steagall now.
Yeah, I think that's
Thank
a
you.
statement rather than a question. Thank you.
The question is not
you.
just a simple, no, I'm not done. You guys
Well-
actually have to get this, because the problem is that people, no, listen. The problem is that people aren't willing to.
This is not fair to the other people who are waiting to speak and who have a reasonably equal right to participate in the conversation. You've taken the first 5 minutes of your time and used it as a declaration not to ask a question. I'd be glad to have this conversation with you outside after the meeting, but please, let's not take up everyone else's time when they came here to listen in part to the questions from the audience. So thank you. So let's move on. I'm sorry. We'll have this conversation afterwards. I'd be glad to do it. You out there later. Thank you. Yes.
Am I on? Okay. It's been, back to the debt ceiling thing, it's been exposed that Timothy Geithner has been involved with a long-term standing correspondence with the head of Standard & Poor's, this guy Beers, Mr. Beers, and on this issue of getting the United States to cut the budget by $4 trillion. Now, what we've seen is bailouts for Wall Street and austerity for the population. My question is, Timothy Geithner was under the administration, Obama's administration, under the advice of Obama. Obama, if you want anything to be done in the immediate period now, like with the, for instance, like providing relief aid for the states right now, we have to actually put him aside. My question is would you be in favor of somehow either constitutionally removing him or sedating him somehow with advisors that actually know what they're doing?
Thank you.
Let me respond to that in slightly more general terms. We had a transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. to make that transition effective and to give the new president freedom of maneuver, he needed to have a new team. He needed to have a team that was not implicated in, had not been architects of, the Bush policies. Secretary Geithner had been the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Chairman Bernanke had already been chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. By making those two appointments, the president basically boxed himself in. He restricted his margin of maneuver, and even if you have nothing against Chairman Bernanke or Secretary Geithner, if you have no criticisms of them, that was a mistake. When a Navy ship goes down, the Navy doesn't wait to find out what happened. It replaces the captain. And you then have a board of inquiry to deal with causes and responsibility. But the point is you need to have command responsibility, and that means you need to bring in new people who can look at the problem with fresh eyes. The same is true with banks. That is the power that the federal government has over the banking system. When a bank approaches insolvency, when it's putting depositors' money at risk, the insurance fund is at risk, the government can come in and change the management of the bank. It's not accusing the old management of anything, that's for later. It doesn't have to prove anything. The point is you get a new group of bankers, and if there are insider deals or anything else, funny accounting, the new guys aren't implicated in it, and they will cooperate with the regulators and straighten things out. Right? Bankers are professionals, right? And that's why you need to make changes. The failure to do that compromised the entire policy toward the financial sector from the very beginning. Sir.
You spoke earlier on the attack on Social Security and Medicare. I believe it was in the 1930s or 1940s, Henry Wallace, the vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, penned an article in the New York Times titled, "What is American Fascism?" He said, whenever you place a dollar value above a human life, that is fascism. Would you consider... That is what, sorry? Fascism. F-A-S-C-I-S-M.
Fascism, sorry.
Fascism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever you place a dollar value over human life, that's fascism. Would you consider the attack on Social Security, the attack on Medicare, cost-effective based health care programs, fascism?
It's a strong word which I don't like to use. I just consider the attacks on these programs to be part of a very long-standing agenda driven by people, some of whom have economic interests, and some of whom simply cannot stand the idea that there are effective, efficiently run public programs that do a job far better than private industry could ever do. There weren't private pensions in any significant numbers before Social Security. This was invented by Roosevelt. You couldn't get health care insurance if you were elderly before Medicare. This was invented by President Johnson. Medicare doesn't pay as much as, the rates are lower than you can get in private practice. But guess what? Doctors like it. Why? Because the government pays, right? They're not fighting with 1,300 insurance companies all the time. Medicare is an efficient and effective system. There's very good reasons from a business point of view why certain people would like to see it destroyed.
Sir, given the current political climate and your considerable experience in economics, how do you account for what, to my perception, seems to be an extraordinary rise in political fanaticism, extremism, cultism, demagoguery, dangerous negative populism on both the left and right, that is some of which I feel we've experienced here tonight. How do you account for this rise over the past 40 years in fundamentalism and various kinds of extremism? I know it's not directly an economic question, but it might connect to economics in some way.
You're right, it's not an economic question. And I don't have a ready answer for you, but I think there is at least one step that we can all take which would lower the temperature dramatically, and that is to turn the television off. And I mean that in a serious way. This is being ginned up for you by forces that are using that medium to very good effect from their point of view, very powerful effect. Doing so is something requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of acumen. It is done by professionals. And I think one finds that this is not a kind of fanaticism that goes very deep in the American community. I don't know what you observe in New England. I suspect you probably, in your personal experience, encounter very little of it. I can tell you that I don't encounter it on a day-to-day basis in Texas either. You know, I think most people in America are as reasonable, decent, full of common sense, and as full of hope and desire for sensible solutions to their problems as they have ever been. Maybe more so. The same kind of fanaticism, by the way, was throughout the 1950s and the Red Scares and the nuclear scares. This is something we can remember. So it's not a new thing in American life. Go back to the Palmer raids in World War I. It is something which is part of a type of manipulation which we can all resist and which we can, I think, overcome. Thank you.
The only way I know of to do something to see that Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security are with us for the long term is to support someone who will support those. And Elizabeth Warren, to me, sounds like someone like that. I was wondering what your view on her views are.
That's an easy question. I'm a great Elizabeth Warren fan. And I have to say, a stellar and sterling citizen of Cambridge.
Yes. From the point of view of senior citizens, on a subtle basis, if we get away from Social Security and Medicare, a good part of the price of the financial rescue of banks and other financial institutions has fell on senior citizens. And I'll give you 3 examples, and then I want your comments. One is they forced CD rates down to about 1%, certificate of deposit, and then they tax that at ordinary income rates. Part 2, the money market funds may earn 0.5%, and they're taking 100% of that money. They're giving like 0.01% of the 0.5%, and they're taking the rest of expenses, and they're not exactly investing in treasuries. Part 3 is the stock market, where 80% of the action is with program trading and hedge fund managers, and it creates under stress. Maybe it helps a little bit with arbitrage, but it creates under stress some volatility in the days where we have the problems. And then part 4 is the corporations, where the people that you might think would go to jail, when the stock was at 40 and then went to 7, they reloaded their stock options at 7, and when the world came back to 14 or 15, they took it all for themselves, you know, and they didn't give it in dividends to the seniors. So I guess the question is, we're worried about Medicare, Medicaid, and everything else, but it seems that there's a heavy burden on senior citizens in the way we've rescued the banks and the financial system.
The answer to your question is yes. And since there are 4 parts to your question, the answers are yes, 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 yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, sir, for answering an email that I sent you in 2009, and because you're the only economist that ever replied, and I had...
You said you came all the way from California to ask this question?
You said that my question is, would he read what I sent now? commented on the enormous impact of the digital revolution, creating the global marketplace and the evolution of robot factoring to take over manufacturing, and nobody ever mentions it among the economists of your age. And I've said the thought pattern has got to change, and I hoped you would lead the attack. Thank you.
I'll tell you something about answering the mail. Actually, I'll tell two short stories about that. One is that my father believed that it was the duty of a Harvard professor to answer all the mail and to do so on the same day it was received. I think he was the only Harvard professor in the history of the university who held such a belief, and how he managed it, I cannot imagine. But when I was a very young member of the staff of the banking committee in the House of Representatives, working on monetary policy under a wonderful and very great congressional leader named Henry Royce, I received from time to time a hand-typed letter from a man who described himself as an economic consultant. His name was Herbert Babb, and he lived in Santa Barbara, California. And the substance of the letter was always the same. It was, if John Maynard Keynes were alive today, he would favor a lower rate of interest, which was perfectly true. And so I always wrote a little note back saying, "Dear Mr. Babb, it's very nice to hear from you again, and of course, you should know that Congressman Royce and I are in very broad sympathy with your position." Words to that effect. And I was at a dinner actually here in Cambridge some years later with a group of economists, and I won't name them, but people who are prominent in this academic community and elsewhere. And it turned out all of them had received similar letters. And I asked, well, did any of you ever reply? None of them had. Well, one day, the last time I ever heard from him, I got a manila envelope from Santa Barbara. And it was a note from Herbert Babb that said, "I think you are the best person to have these." And in the envelope, there were 7 original signed letters to Herbert Babb from John Maynard Keynes. And I said to myself, you know, Galbraith, that's a good reason to answer the mail. The letters went to the Cambridge University archive eventually, but I had them for a while. Sir.
I have a very simple question. In the Globe about a week or two ago, there was an article about an economist proposing to increase inflation as a possible cure to the crisis. Your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's possible to increase inflation in any way that would benefit the American economy. And the notion that the Federal Reserve has a button that they can push, quantitative easing, is just illusory. And I'm afraid it is an illusion which many prominent economists share. Maybe even Chairman Bernanke shares it. But people tried to get the Japanese to increase their inflation rate for almost a decade, and without any luck at all. It's just doesn't work that way. Inflation is an institutional phenomenon that the Federal Reserve, despite what they say in Chicago, does not control.
My question's on tax expenditure programs from either a social policy perspective or a political perspective. If just an open-ended question, if you could comment if this is even true. It seems like they're the prominent way that the government is spending now for reasons that I'm not really apt to guess, but are they effective and justified, or are they subverting the democratic process and wasteful? Are they somewhere in between that spectrum, or just how do you
Sorry,
feel?
is what?
Tax expenditure programs, so the various ways of spending through the tax code, like the new market tax credit program and the low-income housing tax credit program and all the various schemes to support renewable energy and things of that nature, so the spending through the tax code.
You know, the tax code is a tool, just as the spending budget is a tool. The problem with tax expenditures is that they tend to benefit the wealthy much more than anybody else. They tend to be subject to very little scrutiny. and they tend to be fairly ineffective as jobs programs. So this is a good place to look for reform. But the idea that one should have no tax expenditures and a very flat tax structure is also a very bad idea. It would greatly shift the burden of taxation onto the poor, in my view, and that's not something I would favor.
I'm Cole Harrison. I wonder if you could speak more to the international aspects. You mentioned that China will produce what it wants to produce. But today we have a much more globalized market than we used to have, don't we? And we have, hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indians who have joined the workforce in the past 20 and 30 years and are open to wage competition with American workers. So isn't it true that capital is more international than ever, whereas workers are still fighting within a single country to gain reforms and gain regulation within that country? And isn't there much greater international instability because of what's happened with globalization, even though you have American armies marching over the world trying to control the situation? Just how do you see all that?
Let me frame what I think the difference between the United States and China is in slightly different terms. I don't think the fact that factories have sprung up in China, they had factories before they globalized, but that factories which can sell to the world, is a decisive factor. What distinguishes an advanced country from a developing country in the modern world is not whether you have factories. Lots of poor countries have lots of factories. It's whether you have effective standards that maintain and support the life of the population. Right? Just give you an example. If you live in China, and I have lived there for brief periods, you will not go to the market and buy a salad. Bring it home, wash it in under the kitchen tap, and put it on your table. Sorry, you won't do it. Nobody will do it. Why not? The presumption is it's not clean, right? And even if you were the most organic, hydroponic, distilled farmer that ever lived in China, when you brought your product to the marketplace, people wouldn't trust it. So why do we do this as a routine matter? The answer is we trust the system, the United States Department of Agriculture, to bring the lettuce from the fields and bring it to our supermarkets and to our tables in relatively clean condition. And it's not a perfect system. It breaks down. There are people who subvert it. But the market for that, for fresh vegetables, would disappear if we didn't have confidence that that system works reasonably well. Exception to what the rule I just stated, you can get salad in China. You can buy it at Sam's Club, where it comes from California, because the Chinese consumer knows very well that the standards are there. Airlines. Airplanes are wonderful things. They're very advanced pieces of equipment. Not one of us would get in an airplane to fly anywhere if we didn't have complete confidence in the Federal Aviation Administration's air traffic control systems. Because planes coming together at 500 miles an hour in midair is a very unhealthy experience, even if the plane itself is very good, right? Banks. We put our money in a bank not because we trust the management of the bank, but because it's insured. A federal system. And the insurance gives the federal government the mandate to supervise the bank. If the federal government fails to do that, and the federal government deliberately engineered a failure to do that, you have a crisis of the banking system. That's where we are. And that's very serious because that's the absolute heart of the economy. So I would argue that what makes a rich country rich nowadays is not the presence or absence of factories. It is the ability to impose and enforce and maintain the standards of a wealthy society. Its healthcare systems, its education systems, its communication systems, its sanitation systems, its environmental controls. That's what gives us the quality of life that we want. And that is why, to come back to an earlier question about plans, that is why the general attack on regulation is disastrous for our future quality of life. Right? It's disastrous. It is a lining up of the government with the backsliders, with the predatory forces, with the people who don't want to comply, who want to cut corners. Right? And if they're allowed to do that, then the people who want to play by the rules won't be competitive, and the whole country will slide backwards. So maintaining standards, maintaining effective regulation in a whole slew of areas is, in fact, the substance of maintaining an advanced country's level of development. Sir.
Yes, my question, Ms. Galbraith, is one dealing with seniority. Basically, seniors are being somewhat exploited by one of the worst industries in this country that's completely supported by the government. I'm talking about the pharmaceutical industries. The prices are absolutely criminal for what you pay for prescriptions nowadays. And I'd like to know if you have any particular solution. I know President Roosevelt during the 1930s had indicated price controls. And I think that would be a good idea towards the pharmaceutical industries. Thank you.
Yeah. Price gouging by the pharmaceutical industries, as they say in the computer trade, is not a bug, it's a feature. It is a very classic example of the relationship between conservative political power and private industry. I was thinking about that very much when I put as a subtitle of my book, The Predator State, subtitled, How Conservatives Abandoned the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. It seemed to me that liberals should recognize that this is the world we live in. And yes, of course, it's not a mystery how you handle this. Other countries handle it perfectly well. And they handle it by placing their entire healthcare system under schedules and budgets that in a reasonable way provide the services and that in a reasonable way compensate the producers. But there should be no presumption that because you have a product that people need in order to live, that you're entitled to an unlimited financial return for it. And that's fundamentally where we are.
I'm interested in your view on the pragmatics of the political parties that will be facing off in the election coming next year. And the Republicans seem to be, as I understand it, focusing on reducing debt and no new taxes, whereas my understanding is the Democrats are looking for job stimulus and taxing the higher income people. Both Obama, you mentioned, had imperfections in his choices, and the Republicans seem to have a vague, if at all defined, plan. From a practical point of view, which way do you think, which political party has the best, if not great, view for our economic future?
Well, I confess that I'm a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. I continue to be a Democrat. But I think the Democratic Party has a big problem. The Democratic Party has been taken over in the past 30 years by its financial backers. Okay? On economic policy issues, there is a closed circle who run the system, and they're not doing it in the same spirit of Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. So we have to recognize that to bring the Democratic Party back to its values, to its roots, there is a need to change its direction and, to a degree, its leadership. This is fundamental. And that, I think, it's an extraordinarily important task. And yes, in the course of doing that task, you take risks that even worse things will happen. But if you don't take those risks, you're going to end up in a situation in which it's a Democratic administration that compromises away the most valuable social institutions that we have.
Given the pragmatics of next year, would bringing in more Republicans accelerate this change in the Democratic Party, or would it be counterproductive?
You know, I have to look beyond the pragmatics of next year. I think we need to take a longer view. And if the president really wants our support for his reelection, then he needs to work for it.
I would just like to ask, do you think that Hitler's Youthless Eaters policy was an economic policy or a political policy?
I'm sorry?
Was Hitler's useless eaters policy an economic policy or a political decision?
I'm competent on a great many issues, but that's not one of them. Thanks very much.
In fairness, you said you weren't going to go into a lot of detail about your prescription, but if I understood you correctly, you gave us a pretty good teaser. You said that you'd like to see the financial industry fall back to you said utility, I think, just like a utility, yeah. Meat and potatoes, retail, clearing checks, that kind of thing. But then you also said that restoring Glass-Steagall was unfeasible, and that sounded plausible, but it seems like that's kind of the same thing. Separate the speculative investment banking from the meat and potatoes retail stuff. Could you clarify the distinction?
It's a difficult problem, and it's not one that I claim fully to have solved. But I think the way I frame it is the following. You first of all need to clean up the mess that has been festering for well over a decade. You need to reorganize and restructure the existing banking system, which is vastly too big, it's bloated, and you need to concentrate on cutting the larger institutions down to a reasonable size, cutting them up, creating a new competitive environment. You need to do this for economic reasons. If you want small business, as Hyman Minsky liked to say, small banks are good for that. Big banks don't like to work with small business. You need to do it for political reasons, because you don't want the government run by a committee of bankers, effectively, on banking policy. You need to have, no bank should be in a position to control the government, and that is what too big to fail means. That means that the bank has the government over the barrel. That's what it means. That has to be eliminated, and the only way you can do that is to eliminate the systemically dangerous institutions, what are called SDIs by my criminologist friends, right? Systemically dangerous institutions. You need to eliminate them. The government needs to be, in other words, has responsibility for the integrity of the financial system. It needs to be in a position to exercise that responsibility. You cannot have the government staffed by people who are loyal to banking institutions or who expect to go work in them afterwards, right? Which is happening now. This is something which tells you what their incentive structure is as they work in the government today, right? So that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Then I think my answer on the question of how you get financial institutions to do what you need to have done is to look at some of the public, parapublic institutions that were created in the Depression and in other countries after the Second World War that focused on getting loans out in particular activities, particular sectors, supporting, in other words, a strategic direction for the economy. Right? When the French rebuilt after the Second World War, they started with steel and coal, and they went on to hotels and agriculture and all kinds of things, with specialized institutions for each sector that they wanted to develop. We have a different challenge. Energy and environment are extremely important ones, and we should be financing those activities so that businesses, if you want to start a business that is going to, let's say, retrofit office buildings, that you can be sure you're going to have a stable banking relationship with a responsible source of funds that will supervise your activities, give you advice, and monitor your progress. Right? That's what a banking relationship's supposed to do. If we don't have banks doing that, we're not going to get the activity because this will not all be done by government ministries. That doesn't work very well either.
We're coming up on the close of our program. I think we have time for just 2 more questions.
Hi, Mr. Galbraith. This is going to be probably a breathtakingly naive question from an English teacher, but I am teaching this semester a course in the history of utopias and to some degree utopianism, and so although I don't normally think about either political science or economy, I have to think about political economy. And bouncing off a number of little moments in your talk and in your answering questions for us in which you mention on the one hand environmental constraints and on the other hand the need for economic expansion, and on a third hand, there are a lot of hands here, a sort of wry reference to capitalism as particularly, as not perhaps a perfect economic system, and frequently to human nature as a problem with unregulated capitalism in particular. That is, the greed and corruption are going to follow systematically from a lack of regulation in certain places. I just wonder, as you look a long way forward, past the next generation, if you can imagine that some morphing of the current system and where it seems to have brought us into another economic system that might actually require another name other than capitalism.
Oh.
If this is just too silly to answer, just say something.
This is my favorite type of question, which deals with questions of language and nomenclature and economics. I think capitalism, certainly the notion of an unregulated capitalist system, collapsed already in 1929. And if you grew up as I did, in Cambridge in the 1950s and 60s, and in the intellectual climate, which I certainly experienced on Francis Avenue, my father's household, this was not a system that was described as capitalism. Certainly wasn't described as a free market system. That was considered to be a fanciful notion. It was a mixed economy in which the basic structures and institutions had been created, the most important ones under the New Deal. And the New Deal was not seen as some kind of, let's just spend and prime the pump. The New Deal was a vast exercise in national construction. Let's talk about what it did in the South. The South had been in a state of economic collapse, of prostration, since the Civil War, 70 years. And the New Deal began a process through the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and rural electrification, and on of rebuilding and reconstructing, economically reconstructing the South, right? And 70 years after that, the South is about average, wealthier in some places, a little poorer in others, but it's not the desperately poor region that it was in 1940, 1930. So what do we need to do going forward? I think the answer is we need to set a similar set of long-term objectives, articulate them clearly, and pursue them consistently. And it's clear that we are past the age of cheap oil. It's clear that if we continue to pretend otherwise, by, for example, building the Keystone Pipeline that will bring tar sands oil down from Alberta to the Gulf Coast refineries, and in several different ways create a massive environmental catastrophe, right? Something which the president has the authority on his own signature at this moment to prevent, and could if he chose. If we continue down that path, then I don't think we need to worry too much about too many generations into the future, because they will have problems that we can scarcely imagine now. That's the reality. That is the reality. So we need to think now about how we set a path that basically enables us to maintain a high and decent standard of living, a very civilized society, a peaceful society, which, you know, in many ways we actually have compared to much of the world. Maintain the great values of this country in a way which is compatible with the stabilization of the energy and environmental picture. That's a big long-term project that we need to start on now, which can employ a great many people, train a great many people, educate a great many people, organize a great many people, and generally give people very, very meaningful lives within which they can continue to enjoy the highest possible living standards consistent with that goal. That seems to me the right sort of thing to think about.
We've come to the end of our programming time, and I'm sorry we're not able to take further questions. Thank you, James Galbraith, for an extraordinarily informative evening. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in September 2011, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled Our Great Crisis, featuring James Galbraith, or for additional information about our ongoing radio series and our forum network broadcasts, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Richard Parker. Thank you for joining us.